Hello, fellow learners. When I first started listening to podcasts, I came across a big problem. There were way too many. To fix this issue, I explored the internet looking for the best podcast recommendations from people such as Ali Abdaal, Thomas Frank, and Amanda Muse. From July 2022 to now, I have listened to almost 200 podcast episodes. I compiled a list of my 15 favorites I strongly encourage you to check out. For those of you new here, my name is Aiden Helfont. I try to help people instill learning habits into their lives by giving actionable tips on focus, routine, and book/podcast recommendations. First, we have the Tim Ferriss Show, the most popular podcast other than Joe Rogan. And it's not hard to see why. Even though I've only listened to 20 podcast episodes, every single one has changed my life in some way. It's less about the information it gives and more about the wonderful people you meet. Tim doesn't have a defined topic he talks about. He simply invites the most successful and interesting people from all areas of life and has a conversation with them. One of my favorite episodes is 555 with Oliver Burkeman on his book 4,000 Weeks. This came out at a time I was struggling with toxic productivity. Reading this book helped me immensely. I also loved 554 with Jerry Colonna and his thoughts on relaxation through sabbaticals. Finally, you should check out episode 554 with Debbie Millman, who explains how to design a life worth living. Tim Ferriss himself is also fascinating. He has some episodes talking to the camera alone and spouting his wisdom. I particularly enjoyed his episode on taking a yearly review. It helped me fill 2022 with things I love doing and retract from things I hate. Outside of the podcast, he has written some of the most influential books I have ever read, like The 4-Hour Workweek. Next up, we have Hidden Brain, which is hosted by Shankar Vedanta. Hidden Brain is unique to other conversational podcasts in its use of storytelling. Can we stop and admire that man's name as well? Shankar Vedanta. I love saying that name. I have listened to 10 episodes of Hidden Brain because Shankar's talking style is so engaging. He uses science and storytelling to reveal the unconscious patterns driving human behavior. He and his guests' use of storytelling is an integral part of the podcast, making it one of the most entertaining to listen to. Some of my favorite episodes of his were What Makes Relationships Thrive, Creatures of Habit, and The One Room Commute. Next up, we have The Knowledge Project with Shane Parrish. He interviews world-class doers and thinkers so you can utilize what they have learned in your own life. I have listened to 12 episodes of The Knowledge Project. I love it because Shane interviews those doing creative things like me, writing, reading, or creating of some sort. In addition, Shane tends to talk more about philosophy than some other podcasts. So often we idolize those that are intelligent and creative, but what are their lives really like? This podcast gives insight into how it feels at the top. One of the episodes I resonated with was Ryan Holiday, The Stoic Life. Ryan talks about his book creation process and how he organizes his day for deep work. I want to write a book at some point, and this episode gives some insight into what it's really like. I also loved his episode on Curiosity Fuels Creativity and William Irvine, How to Live a Stoic Life. The best episode I have listened to was The Angel Philosopher. Naval Ravikant talks about his philosophy known as rational Buddhism and his unique reading habits. This episode packs so much insight and knowledge, I listened to it twice. Next up, we have Deep Dive with Ali Abdaal. In this podcast, fellow YouTuber and entrepreneur Ali Abdaal dives into the minds of entrepreneurs, creatives, and other inspiring people. He has conversations with guests from wide-ranging areas around the 5 pillars of a good life: health, wealth, love, happiness, and impact. I've listened to 11 episodes of Deep Dive, and Ali Abdaal has been the most significant influence on my entire life. I started my YouTube channel back in March of 2021, primarily due to a video on showing your work made by Ali Abdaal. I took part in cohort 4 of his part-time YouTuber Academy, which revamped my entire YouTube process to what it is today. More recently, I started listening to his new podcast. Some of the episodes which resonated with me are How Productivity Ruins Your Life by Oliver Burkeman, The Real Meaning of Productivity, Unjaded Jade, and How Not to Die Alone, a relationship therapist's guide. By far, my favorite episode is How to Build a $10 million Following Mr. Who's the Boss. Ali and Mr. Who's the Boss discuss how isolating doing YouTube and making a productivity journey can be. When I started my learning journey, I found myself way ahead of many of my old friends in life in goals and habits. I found myself lonely and afraid for a good period of my life. This episode helped me deal with those struggles of finding new friends and learning to love the top. Next up, we have On Being by Krista Tippett. This is the existentialism podcast. Existentialism is the study of being human for those who don't know. Every episode has Krista inviting a guest to talk about big questions of meaning, spiritual inquiry, science, and social healing, and the arts. I have listened to 6 episodes, and every single one makes me look at the world in a different lens. Some of my favorite episodes are Oliver Burkeman, Time Management for Mortals, Gordon Hempton, Silence in the Presence of Everything, and Catherine May, How Wintering Replenishes. The main thing I've learned from this podcast is the importance of awareness. Life is simply a series of present moments, and yet so many people forget to live in the present, instead thinking what they will have for dinner, when they will do their homework, or how long it's been since they had some peanut butter. This podcast taught me to live fully in the present for most of the day. I cherish everything I do so much more now. Next up, we have the Ezra Klein Show by Ezra Klein. Ezra likes talking through difficult problems, climate change, blue-collar workers, and political strife. More than any other podcast, some of the episodes make me think hard about the world's issues. I particularly love the episodes where Ezra invites someone he doesn't agree with. One episode coming to mind is The Case Against Loving Your Job. Ezra is aghast at Sarah Jobs' belief we shouldn't feel like we have to love our job. However, these arguments never get out of hand and make the podcast more interesting as a result. My favorite episodes of his is Timeless Wisdom for Leading a Life of Love, Friendship, and Learning. Ezra speaks with Leon Cast about how to live a good life. I remember listening to this podcast with my family in the car back from Boston. It was so good, I immediately listened to it again the next day using my podcast highlighter, Air. Next up is Bookworm, hosted by Joe and Mike. They read a book or two every other week and discuss their thoughts, as well as giving a rating out of 5. I have listened to 3 podcast episodes and discovered a new book to read every time. One of my favorite books is Daily Rituals by Mason Curry. I even made an entire book summary linked up above. 2 of the other books I've discovered are Oliver Burkeman's 4,000 Weeks and Personal Socrates by Mark Champagne. I suggest using this podcast if you want to read a book and get another perspective on the main takeaways. Next up, we have the Focus Podcast by David Sparks and Mike Schmitz. Mike is one of the co-hosts of Bookworm. If you like Bookworm, you should check out this podcast as well. I have listened to 13 episodes of this podcast. They tackle how we can become more focused in our daily lives. Interestingly, I find David and Mike talking a lot more about the philosophy of life and technology than solely focusing. I think it's more of an anti-productivity podcast. Instead of asking questions like how can we get more done in our days, they ask what can we neglect to leave more room for the other things we want to do. My favorite episodes are Thinking Annually, Toxic Productivity, and Linking Your Thinking with Nick Milo. The Linking Your Thinking episode got me to analyze how I use my note-taking systems to facilitate deeper thought and ideas. I improved my second brain system substantially after watching this episode. If you want to hear more about what building a second brain is, be sure to check out my playlist up above. Last in the Conversational Podcast here, we have The School of Greatness, hosted by Lewis Howes. Lewis interviews some of the most successful people in sports, science, health, and literature from around the planet. I love this podcast so much because of how genuinely curious Lewis is. He routinely asks questions not on script every interview. Because of this curiosity, I have listened to 10 episodes. This podcast helped me most with my relationships. I now understand the problems that typically arise in relationships and what conversations you need to stop them. Now, I'm not dating someone right now, but soon. The major roadblock would be if they didn't like peanut butter. Deal breaker. Some of my favorite episodes include 1205 with Thomas Frank, 1221 with Faith Jenkins, and 1185 on fasting. The episode on fasting was one of the main reasons I began doing so a few months ago. I now have an extra 45 minutes to spend on whatever I want throughout my day. Without breakfast, I feel more focused in the morning. My body is extraneously focused. And when I sit down to write, my hands turn into beams of glistening light as I lift into the air and transfer my soul toward the ancestral plane. Okay, I don't feel that good, but it has improved my writing. First, in the health podcast category, we have Huberman Lab. Huberman Lab is a podcast hosted by Professor of Neuroscience Andrew Huberman at Stanford. He focuses on how neuroscience affects our brain and its connections with our body control, perceptions, behavior, and health. I have listened to 36 episodes of Huberman Lab because of his uncanny ability to distill complicated science into actionable advice. He spends the first half of the episode discussing the complex science of what he's discussing. Then, in the second half, he always gives actionable interventions you can use to live a happier and healthier life. Many of his episodes end up becoming videos in my Mind Hack Sunday series, a series where I distill the current neuroscience literature from books I read as well as this podcast and give you the core ideas. I also use many of his episodes to help create my newsletter, The Learning Logistic. Every Tuesday, I give actionable tips on instilling habits of learning into your life. I will share with you advice on optimizing routine, focus, digital organization, and environment for the best creativity and learning possible. Next up, we have Lifespan with David Sinclair. David Sinclair is a world-renowned aging research doctor who works at Harvard Medical School's Center for Biology and Aging Research. His podcast discusses the science behind why we age and how we can slow and even reverse aging. I've only listened to one episode, but I know I will love this podcast since I listened to Huberman Lab. Dr. Sinclair and Huberman are great friends. Huberman helped Sinclair set up his podcast with a similar theme to his. Huberman and his team have created an entire business model around distilling expert knowledge into podcast content. They plan to expand further in the future and get more experts to host their podcasts under a similar theme. I'm ecstatic to see which other researchers will finally be able to give their knowledge in an understandable way to the common public. Some of my favorite episodes include what to eat and when to eat for longevity, exercise, heat and cold, and other stressors for longevity and the science of keeping the brain healthier. First, in the business category, we have Smart Passive Income, or SPI, hosted by Pat Flynn. SPI focuses on revealing the online businesses and blogging strategies you can use to grow and prosper on the internet. I have listened to 5 episodes of SPI, and apart from Ali Abdal's deep dive, this podcast has been super helpful in kickstarting my online presence. The biggest realization I've learned from Flynn is how long it takes to succeed on the internet. He started blogging 15 years ago. Initially, he blogged to hold him accountable for studying for his architectural exam. It didn't have a wick to do with passive income, but slowly over 15 years, he found out what he wanted to do with his channel, and now he spends his time trying to help others find out the same. My favorite episodes are 474 on Pat Flynn's first hire, 551, Why Lying to Yourself Helps You Become a Better Communicator, and 248, The Art of Giving Gifts. Next, we have the Video Creators Podcast. The Video Creators Podcast focuses on helping you learn cutting-edge YouTube growth strategies. I've listened to 5 episodes and use this podcast to help me with many of the issues I've come across on YouTube. The earlier episodes deal much more with standard questions like how to get views on YouTube. The later episodes are where I find the true juice of this podcast. They detail less known metrics or strategies. My favorite episode is 16 questions that will double your channel growth in 2022. This episode asked me to figure out the journey I was trying to give on my channel. Then I need to figure out what implementing each step of the way looks like for someone with no idea about the topic. These questions led to me discovering 15 new video ideas in 5 minutes. One of them is this video you're watching right now. First, in the history category, we have Philosophize This, hosted by Stephen West. Philosophize This goes over the entire history of philosophy in chronological order. Episode 1 starts with pre-Socratic Ionian philosophy and goes all the way to modern philosophy as we know it. I have listened to 9 episodes and love the journey it brings you on. You don't just hear about various philosophies in isolation, but how they interacted with each other. Before listening, I knew a good amount about philosophy, but didn't know much about when and where they started in relation to each other. My favorite episodes include his episode on the Buddha, Confucianism, and Socrates. Next up, we have Dan Carlin's Hardcore History. Dan Carlin is a journalist and broadcaster, and it shows on his podcast. He tackles history, but through a storyline lens. This isn't the history you're used to learning in school, where key dates and events are regurgitated. Dan makes every historical event seem like some epic movie. His episodes are long, really long. Some of them run upwards of 6 hours. I have listened to 3 episodes and it was all on his King of Kings trilogy. It goes into depth on the fall of the Assyrian Empire and the Persians and Greeks, which took over afterward. Be sure to check out my video playlist on why and how you should start a reading habit. Listening to podcasts is fantastic, but reading books is an entire another medium you can't ignore. As always, have a great rest of your day and bye-bye.